Greetings, YouTube. I was born in 1964. I graduated from high school in 1982. I was 17. I was birthdays in September, so I was always a little younger than the rest of the class. Um, and I remember reading and learning about social studies in very broad terms. And the information I received was very shallow. And I can never, ever remember during any of my 12 years of education. I don't have many memories of kindergarten. Um, Anyone actually getting into the meat and guts of politics. Never really discussing it. Never really talking about what it meant. We didn't really talk about a lot of contemporary things at all. I remember we discussed the Civil War, and I'm not even sure if we ever discussed any wars that were in the 20th century. Honestly, I don't think we did. I have no memory of any of that, if it happened. Again, very broad, vague terms, very shallow. And yet, of course, conservatives will tell you that schools are trying to indoctrinate children into the political agenda of the liberal elite. And that's just not happening in America, period. What passes for social studies and for history in American schools is just one step short of folklore. It is just propaganda. It is American myth making. We don't teach the actual history of America. And of course, conservatives don't want us to, because the actual history of America is really goddamn ugly. It is a history of slavery and exploitation, of xenophobia, of genocide, of exploitation, of colonialism. It's not a good history. If you know history, if you know the American history, you will not be proud to be an American. You'll be glad that that past is behind us, and you'll be hoping that we can be better in the future. But you also know that right now there are times we're not doing any better, and no one indoctrinated me into this. I didn't listen to any particular radio stations or television stations or read particular newspapers or magazines. I just read history. And interestingly, I got into history because I played Dungeons and Dragons. That's what got me into history. Science fiction fantasy novels got me into history as well as science, which led me into sociology, which led me into philosophy, which led me into harder sciences. All of my interests grew out of my love of reading and knowledge, and I did this on my own. There was no external guidance for me. I'm autistic. I was an introvert with access to a city library within walking distance, and now I have access to the internet. I have thousands of books, many of them gaining, but lots of them reference books. I have reference libraries that's very large reference libraries covering all kinds of topics because they interest me. Just today, I bought one on American and European arms and armor. It just fascinates me. So no one indoctrinated me into becoming a progressive, of striving to be an intersectional feminist, striving to be an ally to minority groups, to be an ally to the LGBTQ community. What did it was coming to understand that everyone wants to live their life to their best potential. Everyone is deserving of civil liberties and human rights, that everyone is equal. I arrived at this position because I read, and I read, and I read, and I read. But I did all of this after I got out of high school. While I was reading fiction back then, I hadn't gotten into nonfiction really bad at that point in my life. I mean, during those summer breaks in high school, I would literally read a novel every single day. Over the course of the summer, that I would read 40 or 50 novels, and that would be how I'd spend my summer, unless I was forced to go do something. And sometimes I had to. My mother often forced me to take my sister to the city pool, but I was a good swimmer back then. But we're not indoctrinating children in schools. We're barely teaching them anything. But people become progressive because they learn on their own. And because they look at the world around them and say, this is not fair. And they start looking into why it's not fair. And then they start realizing it's really not fair. And they start to realize that all the things that people seem to cleave to in America are just white nationalistic mythology. All the red caps want to believe in something that only exists in their minds. It never existed in American history. Doesn't exist in America now. It's a myth. They just want a world of nothing but white people, nothing but straight people, nothing but cis people, nothing but Christian people, nothing but people just like them. And that is an incredibly boring and depressing world. I can't imagine anything worse than a world of nothing but bland white nationalists. And take my word for it. If they pulled it off, the first thing they do is to start going after each other again. Because people with that kind of a mindset aren't going to stop once they win. They're just going to start figuring out what's wrong with each other and starting a war all over again. They're never going to be happy until everyone is exactly like them specifically. And if they can't make it happen, they're going to willing to use rhetoric, willing to use violence. Because the words they use now are violent. Their actions are violent. The way they vote is an act of violence. We don't need to indoctrinate children into religious or political positions in America. The white nationalists do that. All progressives have to do is tell you to start reading, start learning, start listening, start looking around. Stop seeing past the mythology. And if you start looking past the folklore, we're in a goddamn mess. And it's not a mess that progressives started. It's a mess that because people are cleaving to a mythology and not willing to leave it behind. We get a choice. We can be stagnant, we can die off as a people, or we can progress and move forward. I believe in the latter more than the former.